right? We want to make the best use of our 50 minutes. So I expect to get a lot more questions next week, especially on Thursday, right? I expect us to have done the readings for the week by Thursday's class. All right, so let's start off with live questions since we did not utilize the link in Canvas. Questions about the course, what's being asked of you? Okay, so I did get a couple questions from, well, one from another class, but because they cover the same content, we can talk about that question as well. But I want to give you to, I thought I changed the time on that, sorry. We are going to get a crash course in logic today, again, just so we get a sense of what we're going to be expected to do next week. So from either having maybe taken a critical thinking class before, I don't know, maybe some of you have taken logic before, who can tell me the difference between a deductive argument and an inductive argument? Not quite. So this is the sort of unintuitive thing about assessing arguments. We're actually going to wait until the very end of the process to figure out whether or not the premises are true, because what we'll often find is that if the structure isn't there, it doesn't really matter if what they're saying is true because the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. So it's going to be about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So hopefully we're all on board with what I mean when I say that. So arguments in philosophy are reasons for thinking that something is the case, right? So we don't mean like the way people argue in the real world, right? We have standards, there are rules. And so we can classify argumentation, right, into two general types. And it tends to be about the types of support, right, or the relationship between the support or premises and the thing being supported, that is the conclusion, right? So the idea is that we want a particular type of relationship between the support and the conclusion, between the premises and the conclusion. So for deductive arguments, that relationship is intended to provide us with certainty, right? So the idea is that if you've constructed a deductive argument, and hopefully you've done it well, the idea is that if the premises are true, then hopefully the conclusion will have to follow, right? There's something about the structure that is going to try to guarantee the truth. Whereas inductive arguments, and then just because of the structure of them, are only at best able to give us probabilistic reasoning, right? So inductive arguments can never guarantee the truth of their conclusion, no matter how strong they are. And so what's really fascinating about this is when you think about the world that we live in and what we consider to be knowledge, pretty much everything we consider to be knowledge, things that we think we know, that we think we're certain about, it's actually all based on inductive reasoning, right? This includes scientific knowledge. So the very famous problem of induction, which we're going to see older versions of in the Eastern tradition, but unfortunately, a Scottish philosopher gets the credit for it. That's David Hume, right? Who also very much advocated for science, pointed out that all of the knowledge we get from science is based on past experience, right? And then we generalize from that experience to make predictions about the future. But we can't know for sure, right, that those predictions will be true, even if they've been true in the past, right? So the classic example of this is, most of you probably think you know for sure that the sun will rise tomorrow. But in fact, all you know is that the sun has risen every day in the past, right? We cannot know the future. And so much of what we think we're certain about, we're actually not, right? When it comes to applying standards to reasons. Okay, and so when we create our arguments, we want the best type, right? We want deductive arguments. And those are especially useful in religious arguments because there often isn't a mechanism, at least not, technologically available to us yet, which is that we can't ever really go out into the world to check and see if they're true. So usually what we do is we look at the structure, we see if it's successful, right? So for deductive arguments, they can be valid or invalid, right? So this has to do with whether or not the structure of the argument works together such that, again, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to follow. So let me give you a really ridiculous argument. If the tuna monster exists necessarily, then we should all worship at the altar of the fish. I don't know. All right. So this is what we call a conditional statement, right? Just an if then. So, and again, this is really useful knowledge if you're interested in coding and things like this. But the idea is that logically speaking, we can only infer or derive certain things from this statement given other evidence that we have, right? And so there are a couple things that we can do to make this argument valid, and there are a couple things we can do to turn this into an invalid argument. So I'm going to show you both so that you can see the subtle differences. Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 different versions of what we could put on premise 2, right? 4 different possible conclusions. Again, 2 of them are going to be valid, 2 of them are going to be invalid. Okay, so the first set is going to be the tuna monster exists necessarily. Who thinks they know what should follow from that? Therefore, so if the tuna monster exists necessarily, then we should all worship at the altar of the fish. The tuna monster exists necessarily. Therefore, what? What follows from that? There we go, Jordan, very nice. We should all worship at the altar of the fish. Okay, so I gave you a set of conditions that needs to be met, and then what happens if they meet. That's what a conditional statement does. So we satisfied that criteria, right? The tuna monster exists necessarily. Therefore, we should all worship at the altar of the fish. Now, obviously, one of these statements are clearly false, or even if they were possibly true, we could never know that they were true, right? So we can't always utilize that last piece of the argument. But if we could, right, then we would judge whether or not this argument is sound or not. And we would probably want to say that this argument is not sound, right? Which means that it's deductively valid, it has the right structure, but it's not true in the world, right? Okay, so next one. If the tuna monster, exists necessarily, then we should all worship at the altar of the fish. So what if I say the tuna monster does not exist necessarily? Can I derive anything from this? Does that mean that we should not all worship at the altar of the fish? That's what would seem to follow, right? It follows the same pattern as before. This move is actually invalid though. And the reason is that we are only working with the information that we are given, right? So again, if the tuna monster exists necessarily, then we should all worship at the altar of the fish. We don't know what we should do if the tuna monster does not exist, not necessarily, right? We're presuming we know, but that information actually hasn't been provided, right? So we only know what to do if the tuna monster exists necessarily, if we affirm this first part. We don't know what will happen if that's not the case, right? So a little bit tricky there. Tends to make a little bit more sense if you use less politically correct examples. So I could say, if I eat a lot of French fries, then I will get fat, right? Just because I didn't eat a lot of French fries doesn't mean I can't still get fat, right? Again, so we only know what's happening if the tuna monster exists or if I eat French fries. All right, any questions about those two? The differences between them. All right, so then we're moving on to the next two. So again, we're working with the same first premise. If the tuna monster exists necessarily, then we should all worship at the altar of the fish. Now we're going to deal with the second part, okay? We should not all worship at the altar of the fish. Can I derive anything from this, from these two statements together? Very good, Riley. Okay, so if we deny the consequent, we can also then infer that that initial criteria hadn't been met, because if it had been, then we should we should worship at the altar, right? But since we shouldn't, then that must mean the tuna monster does not exist necessarily, or not that it doesn't exist, but specifically in this case that it doesn't exist necessarily. Good, 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 good. Okay, so now we're going to try the opposite of that, right? So same first premise, tuna monster exists, blah, blah, blah. Now we're going to say we should alter. Oops, can I derive anything from this? Again, Maddox, that's what would seem to follow, right? So if we're playing by the same logical rules, then we would think the same sort of pattern. But again, here, we're violating the rule of the conditional statement. We only know, right, that we should, so if the tuna monster exists necessarily, then we should all worship at the altar of the fish. But unfortunately, we don't know if there are restrictions on what else could make us worship at the altar of the fish. So even if it's true, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that the tuna monster exists. So again, think of the French fry example. If I eat French fries, then I will get fat. Just because I got fat doesn't mean I ate the French fries, right? Again, it's that reverse relationship where we don't know what else, right, could potentially make me fat. That's information that hasn't been provided to us, right? So we're always trying to go just on the information that is provided to us to assess the strength of an argument, right? So I'm going to share with you all now a little tool. And it is not something that you're going to see me share much in the future, because I want you guys to try this for yourselves next week when you create your own arguments. But this is really helpful, because as you type in certain pieces, right, like I just did, just creating examples hypothetically, you will see it automatically populate that same verbiage in the other places of the argument to ensure it's valid, right? So you won't be able to do the mistake ones, right? It'll force you to keep a valid argument. So play around with that. Help get yourself familiar with these relationships, because again, it's going to help us make sure that we're presenting very good argument. It's going to help us assess other people's arguments down the line. All right, so questions about validity, invalidity, the difference between those argument forms I just showed you. 4 different examples. All right, someone asked me a question before we move on. We definitely need to be popping our questions into that form before class so that we can avoid this. You guys have no questions on logic, argumentation, deduction, induction, validity. Okay, I got high expectations with all this lack of questionings. All right, maybe you're all just super excellent coders and this is just all stuff you've already come across. Okay. So then if that's the case, we'll do a little practice. Give me a second. Review those argument forms while I pull up a little practice. Okay, I'm gonna copy and paste this into our Zoom chat so that you don't see the answers. All right, so here in the chat, you can see a Kevin, your profile picture, thank you. That's hilarious. All right, so in this passage, right, we're going to see if there is an argument present, and if so, we're going to try to extract that argument and assess it, right? Figure out if it's deductive or inductive. Okay, so humanities courses, including philosophy, play a critical role in public education and deserve to be offered. A well-rounded education includes learning about art, music, philosophy, and other fields that shape the human experience. Without these classes, college students would miss out on crucial opportunities to grow as individuals. So clearly lacking the structure we were just talking about, right? But most arguments aren't given in that formal structure, right? So part of what we are doing with our brains, right, is extracting the basic information from what we're seeing or what we're hearing and trying to reformulate it to see if it can fit a form that guarantees the truth of its conclusions. And again, even if it's inductive, that's okay. We still have ways of assessing it, right? So we can assess its strength or its weakness. Do the reasons make the conclusion more likely to be true versus less likely to be true, right? So still ways of assessing both. But we also want to avoid fallacies, right? Which is part of what you read for this week, right? We want to make sure that there are no errors in reasoning being used, or that we don't engage in any errors when we critique an argument. All right, so first off, is this an argument? Why or why not? Good, Jordan. So this is an argument, not only because it's making a claim, but because it's giving you reasons to support that claim, right? So in philosophy, when we talk about an argument, we literally mean reasons for thinking that something is the case, right? Then we can figure out whether or not they're good reasons. But yes, there is a claim being made, but more importantly, there are reasons, at least one reason. I think, in fact, we've got at least 2 reasons in this case being given to support that claim. Okay, good. Good, and this is an argument in favor of the claim, right? So good, it's not critiquing it, it's the reasons are in support of that conclusion. Okay, so then we want to ask ourselves, what type of argument is it? Inductive or deductive? Do the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, or do they only make the conclusion more likely? Joseph, inductive, very good, right? So a well-rounded education includes lots of things, right? But again, who's to say we couldn't get these things from other places, or they couldn't be incorporated in lots of different ways, right? Again, you will hear me making the case about how philosophy is everywhere, right? I'm sure teachers of other disciplines would say the same thing. Okay, so again, without these classes, college students would miss out on crucial opportunities. Again, we don't know that they're not necessarily getting those opportunities outside of the classroom, right? Again, art, music, these things are everywhere. Okay, but they might give good reason to believe. So what do we think? Do these make the conclusion more likely to be true or less likely? What sort of inductive support are we talking about here? Is it strong or weak? Medium, weak. No one thinks it's strong. Oh, Ahmad, you think it's strong? This is a little, right? It's a little bit subjective here. I don't think there's a clear right answer as to the strength of this. I think it could be made stronger. I think as 3 sentences alone, it's probably, bordering on the middle, but maybe a little bit more, like I think more than 50%. So I'm gonna say it's on the strongish side, right? More likely than not to be true. And here it's saying that the only thing it's trying to show is that humanities courses, including philosophy, play a critical role, right? And deserve to be offered. So it seems like a good reason for that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, good. Okay, another example coming at you. 1 second. This one's a little more likely to be encountered in an argument, right? So you've already said that you love me and you can't imagine spending the rest of your life without me. Once you even tried to propose to me, and now you claim that you need time to think about whether we should be married. Well, everything that you've told me regarding our relationship has been a lie. In some of your letters to a friend, you admitted that you were misleading me. You've been telling everyone that we're just friends, not lovers. Oh my God. And worst of all, you've been secretly dating someone else. Why are you doing this? It's all been a farce and I'm out of here. First off, is this an argument? Yes. Yes. No, Ahmad, why do you say it's not an argument? Ahmad, what's our thinking on it not being an argument? There seems to be making a number of points against him, but those are the points, right? The things that he did, right? So the claim, first we want to identify what a potential conclusion would be, right? And then we want to see if the other statements lend support for that. So Sean, the conclusion would be to break up. Yeah, it seems to be that last sentence here, right? It's all been a farce and I'm out of here. Kind of seems like an end to the relationship, right? Or do we think, or maybe the one about it all being a lie, sort of similar? Yeah. Yeah, and so the other statements, we want to ask ourselves, do they lend support for that, Sean? And I agree, they do seem to support that, right? And so those would be the reasons, the premises. So then we need to ask ourselves, what type of support is it trying to give, right? If the conclusion is that, the relationship is over and they're a liar, right? Or something like this, then does the evidence make that conclusion only more likely to be true, or does it confirm beyond a doubt? Jordan says inductive. Yeah, Sean, I'm a little with you. I think if we played around with the semantics of this, I bet we could come up with some if you loved and wanted to be with me, you would do these things. You didn't do these things, right? Or if you loved and supported me, you wouldn't have done these things. You did those things, right? So yeah, I think we could set that up in a deductive way. Okay, so then we have to check, are there any sort of fallacious lines being used in this? Okay, so does anyone see any fallacies? Are there personal attacks? I don't see any name calling. All lies, but I mean, that's a claim, right? And they're giving reason to back it up. Yeah, I'm not seeing any fallacious reasoning in here. All right. Yeah. So again, right, this can be tricky, but it's useful, right? It's useful in our being able to decide whether or not we think the good reason is playing a role. And again, this is all especially useful sometimes to try to remove ourselves a little bit from the situation, right? Imagine if that argument were about really serious, maybe legally ramifying things, or life or death things, right? There's violence or something like that can also really affect us emotionally and sometimes cloud our judgment as to whether or not the structure and the support is actually there, right? So we want to make sure that we're able to do that sort of work regardless of whether or not the statements are even true. Then if that structure is there, we can go out into the world and check if they're true. Because if even if they're true, but the structure is not there, then it doesn't really matter because it doesn't support their conclusion, right? Good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about fallacies, because that is what sort of some of the questions border on, right? And so this has to do with the extent to which we should take, people's individual circumstances or background into account. So I'm going to read these questions to you first, then we can talk about them. So the first one is the readings talk about some rare circumstances where it's okay to use a person's background to change what we think about their argument, but it doesn't list any. When is it fine to do that? This is an excellent question. Okay, and it actually brings up a traditional difference between two approaches. The one is called analytic and the other is called continental. And so these are two different ways of approaching philosophy. And in the West, it's of course traditionally been the analytic tradition, in that there has been this view that we should be able to assess the arguments that a person has laid out in their work, irrespective of any personal idiosyncrasies about that individual, right? That the work should be assessed on its own so as to avoid fallacies and biases, right? So it's often well-intentioned, right, trying to be more objective. The continental approach, though, says that that is misguided and potentially even dangerous, right, because of the level of misogyny and racism, specifically white supremacy, that has underscored most historical biases, right? And so if that's the case, they say we should absolutely take into account not just the person, right, who gives that argument, but even maybe the socioeconomic historical context, right, that argument emerged from. But there's a fine line, right? That doesn't mean that we can just outright dismiss or accept something merely because of where it comes from. The question is whether or not to take those things into consideration, and then how to take them into consideration, right? So the analytic tradition says don't take them into consideration. The continental approach says take them into consideration, but, right, use them to assess the argument in that context, right? So we're not just going to be assessing it compared to our view now, but we do want to say, well, if there were a certain set of values that were inherent in that time, right, or in that person when they came up with this view, if you can establish that those values have seeped into the philosophies, the ideas themselves, and that those pose dangerous consequences in the way that they're applied today, then, right, maybe it is a good reason to reject it, right? But it's not a fallacy because you've done the work of, going through and establishing your reasoning, and then we can assess whether or not they're good reasons. The fallacious thing would just be merely to accept or reject something merely because of the source of the information, right? So this happens a lot. Someone will say something and we're just like, well, I don't trust you, or you're a terrible person, so whatever you say is false. That is fallacious reasoning, right? I'm sure you've heard the saying, even a broken clock is right 2 times a day. Just because someone is maybe even a compulsive liar doesn't mean that every single thing out of their mouth is going to be a lie, right? Doesn't mean that everything that they believe is false. So it might be good reason to not take that person as a credible source, right? But it's not necessarily a reason to reject the claim outright, right? The idea is that, okay, well, if we can't trust the source of the information, then we just need to go elsewhere and do additional research, right? But it's not reason enough to accept or dismiss either way. Good. So questions about that, questions about the extent to which the source of information should factor in. Questions about this? Joseph, yes. Okay, good. So we do want to still assess the reasons that they're giving us, right? Now, here's the tricky thing, though. Like, I could technically make up a piece of evidence, but if it happens to be true and it's a good reason, right? Does the fact that I made it up diminish it? Right? Like, if it's a good enough reason on its own, right? The idea is that it shouldn't even matter if I was, malicious in my intent or something like that. Right? The assessment of whether or not the statements are true is going to be irrespective of that, is the idea. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, Sean, I think the source should factor in more often than not, especially in today's society. Good. So again, credibility of sources is huge, right? Absolutely. But the idea is that the credibility of the source is not sufficient enough to dismiss a claim outright, right? just because the source is not credible doesn't mean every single thing they say is a lie, is the idea, right? Is that we ought to have other reasons for rejecting it. And again, the same thing goes the other way. Sometimes we're like, oh man, that's just so ridiculous, it's got to be true, right? So like that, no, it doesn't work that way, right? We need reason to accept and reject things. Again, we can have good reason to be skeptical or maybe even remain agnostic if we don't trust the source, but then that's it, right? We just need to remain undecided until we get more information. Now you could use inductive reasoning, right, to help fill that gap. That's what most people do, right? And the extent to which that is relevant, I think, will depend on the situation, right? So in some cases, let's say if we're trying to debate, you know, whether or not George Clooney is floating outside my house right now, you appealing to your past experience, it's going to be really relevant there, right? To people not floating around, and especially not celebrities, right? Floating around people's backyards. But if, say, we're talking about, you know, systemic discrimination, and, you know, I can't help but notice the gender makeup of the class. It's predominantly masculine, right? You know, my personal experience is going to be more relevant than yours if we're talking about, you know, misogyny or something like this, right? Where it's going to be different if we're talking about race, right? Then some other people's perspectives are going to be more centered and relevant. So again, it depends in some cases. And I think a good way of judging is to look at the stakes involved, right? So that is the significance of the outcomes, right? The consequences, right? Weighing them. So if the stakes are lower, right, then maybe your bar doesn't need to be as high as to who you're deeming credible and things like this. But when it comes to things that people's safety, right, health, safety, and livelihood are on the line, maybe your bar should be a little bit higher, right? And again, we could say the same thing for all types of reasoning. You know, if I'm going to go to the movies later, maybe, you know, it's going to be not super big deal if I do some inductive, you know, guessing as to what's going to be playing in the theater. And maybe I just need more than a 50% likelihood that I'm right for me to take that chance. But maybe I want a little bit of higher bar if I'm, you know, going to get surgery, right? So maybe a, you know, 60% likelihood that they're playing the movie I want to see is enough for me to go to the movies. But maybe I want like 80% success rate on surgery, not, you know, so again, it depends. Your bar should be relevant to the stakes of the situation in terms of inductive reasoning. I think that's a good sort of marker, if that's helpful. Other questions about this or ideas? All right, so then the next question we have is, when people have preferences that exclude traits of racial groups or the group as a whole, is it really considered a preference, or is it considered racism, or could it be something more complex? Good, right? So this is getting into now our judgments about others, right? Value judgments in particular. And here too, I think, you know, the stakes are going to matter. You know, we can talk about racial preferences in dating and sexual relationships, and the stakes there are potentially, you know, not historically, but potentially going to be a little bit lower than, say, talking about the criminal justice system, right? And the way that we make IDs, you know, IDing perpetrators or, you know, individuals, the way racial bias plays into that, racial blindness in particular, like we're really bad at, statistically, we're really bad at identifying distinct facial characteristics from people of different racial ethnic groups, right? So if you're going into criminal, right, there are lots of ways in which people's preferences in terms of race do have super high stakes consequences, right? In terms of what counts as truth, and then the implications for individuals or groups, communities, based on the outcomes of those claims. Right? Whereas again, in other cases, it might be a little bit less significant. So in the case of, say, dating profile or, you know, a dating type, someone might, you know, if they say like, yeah, I'm only attracted to white people, that's going to be problematic. But if you say, well, I'm attracted to people of all different races, but I only find people attractive if they have what are considered to be traditionally Caucasian, you know, features, that can border on the problematic, right? Because it can reinforce the idea that anything other than that, right, standard is considered not beautiful, right? So there's some gray area here that, you know, I think you'll all have to make some decisions for yourselves. But yeah, do we have any thoughts on this? Whether or not our preferences, if race at all plays a factor, does that mean that they're racist? What do we think? And again, we can incorporate this with other types of discrimination as well, based on demographics. What do we think? Yeah, but even if it's implicit, that doesn't mean it's not problematic, right? You don't believe a preference can be racist. How come? Definitely with the fetishization. John, very good. But Ahmad, why don't you think a preference can be racist? Because I think most people, I think that their intuition is to agree with that. But what's your reasoning? Ahmad, you there? Okay. But do we not think that racism can also be that, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so this is tricky, right? I mean, honestly, it's even coming up in the voice you choose on your digital assistant, right? So maybe you've heard some of these debates. Some people are much more comfortable having a female voice as their assistant, right? And we might say, is that preference sexist, right? Are you more comfortable with having a woman assist you, right? Being in that subservient role than you are having a man. Or like, I personally have a preference for the black male voice over the white male. Like, I don't even know what that means, right? So it's very interesting, right? So yeah, we have these preferences, and they absolutely are going to be implicit, things that we maybe haven't even questioned. We're not exactly sure where they came from, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not potentially problematic. Don't give them a chance. Yeah, good. So right, again, maybe that initial just disregard or not. Good. Again, deep questions, big things, not going to get clear answers, right? But things to think about as we go through the world. And, you know, part of me thinks that maybe like the pansexuals are the most, you know, enlightened individuals, and they can just see past everything and just be attracted to the individual. I don't know. I don't know. But it's, yeah. What about, yeah, exactly. Demisexual. So yeah, people that are able to break beyond these categories. And, you know, there is some psychological or empirical evidence to suggest that mental health in some cases is actually easier. I shouldn't say it this way, because there's a whole nother set of mental health issues that come up with facing a heteronormative society when you're outside of the norm. But if we take the simple example of, you know, just like appearance and beauty norms, right? We're constantly bombarded every day with traditionally, this is changing a little bit, but with traditionally a very monolithic sense of what is beautiful, right? Especially what is considered to be a beautiful woman. And so if someone doesn't ascribe to traditional femininity or traditional masculinity, they might not feel pressure to conform to these norms when they see them the same way a cisgendered woman would be, right? Because that's directly calling out to her identity, whereas maybe it's not calling out to people who are outside the binary. So there are some cases where, yeah, breaking outside of these boundaries might even have a mental health benefit, added benefit, in that messaging that's supposed to be telling you what you're supposed to be because you're part of this group. You're saying, well, I'm not part of that group, so, you know, who are you to tell me what I should be? To beauty norms. Okay, so yeah, good. So beauty is subjective, interesting. But so then what do we think about this? Because there is a clear, I mean, most people would say problem, but there is at least a phenomena in the world of bleaching skin, right? People getting plastic surgery to conform themselves to a specific view of beauty. I think the skin bleaching is the most potentially harmful one, right? So because the beauty norm has historically been white or Caucasian, right? People are, when they feel like they're not beautiful, they invest money, their entire economic systems, right, developed to supporting this. Appreciation. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, right. Racist beauty standards. Exactly. Right. So how do we deal with that? How can something be a preference, and still be problematic in this way? So again, these are brand new questions probably for a lot of you, and we probably haven't had time to think through all of our reasoning, right? And so some of us might be realizing, well, oh, I need to consider this now, right? So what does that mean? If can beauty be problematic in that way, or standards of beauty? If so, why? And if not, why not, right? And again, what does that mean? So consider the world around you and these types of questions, and have a wonderful weekend. I think that's the perfect place to stop because for this week you have your first set of graded assignments. So you've got discussion number one, quiz number one. Please note the late policies if you're worried about any of the deadlines. And you're going to be picking your topic for your writing assignment this week. So it doesn't have to be completely, nailed down, but you want to at least get a sense of something that you're interested in working on for the entire quarter. Okay, 12 or 11 now, 11 weeks, right? This is your project. So pick something that you really care about. And all it has to do is be related to Eastern philosophy. So because philosophy is such a huge field, you can really talk about anything, but you're gonna have to incorporate an Eastern component somehow. It can be one of the traditions, it can be one of the philosophers, it can just be, a general sort of Eastern approach that we're taking. You can really be creative, but pick something that you care about, that you're gonna want to work on every week. All right, and I'll leave the last few minutes of class for any questions that people might have, but otherwise, please utilize the shared glossary on Canvas. I've been posting the recordings, so take a look at those if you need a refresher or you missed anything, as well as all the other wonderful resources. And questions for next week, right? Please be sure to submit questions before class. That is really helpful, I think. And we got some good questions. They made for a very fruitful conversation. Good. Thank you, Ahmad. Have a great day. Ooh. Sean, can I share your question with the class? Because that's a great question. Yeah, okay, yes. So Sean's question was, can I potentially use one of my favorite sci-fi novels as inspiration for your paper? Absolutely. So one of the most amazing things about Eastern philosophy is that the writing takes place, because it's not historically as analytic a tradition, the writing is very literary. So we're going to be seeing lots of storytelling. And so, drawing analogs from other literary inspirations for your paper, awesome. Love it. Totally on the mark. Yes. Yeah, again, as long as we put that Eastern philosophical spin on it, it's really your imagination is the limit. All right. Well, have a great day, you all. I'll hang out for the next couple minutes in case there are any questions.